The Global Accumulation of Capital and the Periodization of the Capitalist State Form by Simon Clarke. The Problem of Periodization. The periodization of the capitalist mode of production is an attempt to find a middle way between empiricism, which stresses historical contingency in order to legitimate a political opportunism, and reductionism, which stresses the unchanging laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production in order to legitimate a dogmatic fundamentalism. The periodization of the capitalist mode of production is supposed to provide a way of defining intermediate structures which determine the regularities and systemic features pertaining in a particular historical epoch, so as to provide a scientific foundation for a political strategy which can engage with the current conjuncture. The basis of the various periodizations, which have been proposed over the years, has been the periodization of the dominant forms of accumulation, but the primary purpose of such periodizations has been to relate the changing forms of accumulation to changing forms of the state and of the political class struggle. However, the simplistic conceptions of the state on which the dominant periodizations have been based have undermined their theoretical coherence, their empirical applicability, and the political validity of their conclusions. This is as true of the recent periodizations proposed by the regulation theory and the social structure of accumulation approach as it was of the orthodox theory of state monopoly capitalism, all of which has been rested on a simple, functionalist theory of the state. This reduces the activity of the state to an expression of the functional needs of accumulation expressed in the interest of capital, and presumes that the state can, at least in principle, meet those needs by intervening to resolve the contradictions of capitalist accumulation. This narrow conception of the state is associated with an inadequate theorization of the inherent contradictions of accumulation, which underlies the presumption that the state can indeed resolve those contradictions. The aim of this paper is to ask whether a more adequate theorization of the contradictory form of accumulation and the more sophisticated theorization of the capital state can provide the basis for a more adequate periodization of the capitalist mode of production in the capitalist state form. The starting point of my attempt is the state debate of the 1970s, which appears at first sight to offer a fruitful way forward, which failed to provide an adequate account of the contradictions inherent in capitalist accumulation. On the basis of an alternative account of the relationship between the state and the contradictory form of capitalist accumulation, I will then outline what appears to be a theoretically coherent and empirically plausible periodization of the capitalist state form. Finally, I will submit the proposed periodization to a more critical review, concluding that the substantive weakness of the periodization reflects a theoretical and methodological error inherent to the enterprise itself. Overaccumulation, class struggle, and the state. The state debate of the 1970s tried to develop an analysis which was simultaneously logical and historical, which might have been expected to lead to a periodization of the state. The attempt never really got off the ground, primarily because it proved impossible to find a coherent principle on which to base such a periodization. Joachim Hirsch proposed a periodization of the capitalist state form, whose phases were related to the mobilization of different counter-tendencies to the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, but he never elaborated this approach. Holloway and Picciotto, in keeping with their emphasis on the primacy of the class struggle, outlined 3 stages in the development of the capitalist state form related to the relationship between capital and the labor process from an initial external relationship through the phase of the absolute surplus value production to the phase of production of relative surplus value. Although this can be interpreted as a periodization, which superficial similarities to that of Aglietta, Holloway, and Picciotto did not use it as such, but rather as the basis of a historical explanation of the progressive development of different aspects of the capitalist state form, which continue to coexist as moments of the developed form of the capitalist state. Such debate as there was over periodization of the capitalist state form did not get very far, and becoming bogged on over the issue of the character of the absolutist state. Hirsch later took up the functionalist periodization of the regulation approach as the basis of his reformulation of state theory, while Hirsch's work had the merit of integrating a more sophisticated theory of the state into the regulation approach. It did nothing to remedy the theoretical and historical inadequacy of the latter. In this paper, I want to sketch out an alternative approach to the periodization of the capitalist state form based on an alternative characterization of the contradictions inherent in the accumulation of capital. My starting point is the argument that the driving force of accumulation, imposed on individual capitals by the pressure of competition, is the tendency for capital to develop the productive forces without limit. The response of capitalists to competition is not, as bourgeois economists would have us believe, tamely to adjust production to the limits of the market, but is to seek out new markets by commercial expansion and by displacing backward forms of production, and to reduce cost by lengthening the working day, forcing down wages, intensifying labor, and above all by transforming methods of production. The constant tendency to develop the productive forces underlies the tendency for capital, from its earliest stages, to develop the world market and the generalized capital social relations of production on a global scale. However, the tendency to develop the productive forces without regard to the limit of the market also underlies the tendency to the global overaccumulation and uneven development of capital, as the development of social production confronts the limits of its capitalist form as production for profit. Although the tendency of the overaccumulation of capital appears in its most dramatic form with the emergence of a generalized crisis of overproduction, it is not only a feature of such dramatic crises, but also of the everyday reality of accumulation as the pressure of competition leads to an intensification of class struggle, the devaluation of backward capitals, and the destruction of productive capital, and the displacement of labor. The relationship of the state to the contradictory form of overaccumulation is not established directly, but is mediated by the form of the state. The class character of the capital state is defined by the separation of the state from civil society and the corresponding subordination of the state and civil society to the rule of money and the law. While the subordination of the state to money defines the economic form through which the overaccumulation crisis appears to the state and sets the limits on the powers of the state, in response to such crisis, it does not determine the specific political form of the state, though which the contradictory tendencies of accumulation are mediated politically, nor the specific responses to the state in the face of the crisis. The political form of the state is determined by the class struggle, and most particularly by the struggles of the working class, which arise as the working class confronts the subordination of the social reproduction to capital as a barrier to its own physical and social reproduction. Although the state is constituted politically on a national basis, its class character is not defined in national terms. That's a key thing to note. The capitalist lists law property and the contracts transcending national legal systems and world money transcending national currencies. Thus, the subordination of the state to the rule of money and law confines the state within limits imposed by the contradictory form of the accumulation of capital on a world scale. However, the political stabilizations of the state has to be achieved on a national basis, which presupposes in general that the state is able to secure the expanded reproduction of domestic productive capital. On the one hand, this is the only basis on which the relative surplus population can be absorbed, and so the physical and social reproduction of the working class reconcile with its subordination to capital. On the other hand, it is the only basis on which the state can secure its revenues and so meet increasing demands on its resources. The result is that, in the most general terms, the contradiction inherent in capitalist accumulation appears to the state in the forms of the barrier to the sustained accumulation of domestic productive capital presented by the overaccumulation of capital on a world scale. Although the state cannot resolve the contradiction inherent in capitalist accumulation, it can contain the political impact of those contradictions to the extent that's able to secure the integration of the accumulation of domestic productive capital into the accumulation of capital on a world scale, and so provide a basis on which to secure the political integration of the working class. The limits of the ability of the state to achieve this are not defined only by the form of the state as a national state, but more fundamentally by the form of the international state system and the corresponding modes of integration of global accumulation, of which is a part. The periodization of the mode of integration of global accumulation correspondingly underpins the periodization of forms of the capitalist state. All this is very abstract, but I think it provides a basis for much more concrete analysis and periodization of the capitalist state form. Although the idea of the overaccumulation of the capital outlined above is abstract, and it provides the basis of a periodization because of the tendency to the overaccumulation and uneven development of capital defines not only quantitative relationships summed up in a movement of the rate of profit, but also qualitative relationships in the changing form of the sectoral and geographical unevenness of accumulation, and in changing forms of class struggle to which overaccumulation has given rise. The bulk of the paper will outline a provisional periodization into 4.5 stages, with the transition from one to another being determined primarily by the form and development of the class struggle in the face of a crisis of overaccumulation. However, at the end of the paper, I want to muddy the waters by suggesting that the crisis of Keynesianism and the rise of Monetarism indicates that this periodization is spurious and that conceals some more fundamental continuities. But for now, the stages are as follows. Mercantilism. This defines the typical form of the 18th century state based on the global expansion of commercial capital. The overaccumulation of commercial capital led to an increasing international competition, costly commercial and colonial wars, and the penetration of capital into production, which undermined the global integration of accumulation in the economic and political and ideological foundations of the mercantilist state form, while providing the basis for the transition to the next stage. Liberalism. The liberalization of the state into the first half of the 19th century was based primarily on an international division of labor between the intensive accumulation of capital in British manufacture and the extensive accumulation of capital in agriculture everywhere else. Although the liberal state form was never able to contain the struggle of the emerging working class, so the economic liberalism was by no means necessarily accompanied by political liberalism, ad hoc expedients of repression and reform sustained the liberal form of the state until the global overaccumulation crisis of the 1870s. Imperialism. Imperialism and social reform emerged as the state sought to sustain domestic accumulation and accommodate the organizing working class through the more or less active regulation of international trade and investment. The result of such efforts was the politicization of international competition on a national basis and the rise of militarism, culminating in global war and revolution. Social democracy. The interwar period saw a vain attempt to restore liberalism, which only led to a revival of imperialism and militarism. Don't you just hate it when that happens? It also saw the emergence of the elements of the social democratic form of the state, which was systematically developed in the post-war Reconstruction period, where the sustained accumulation of capital on a world scale, within the framework of a liberalization of international trade and payment, made it possible to contain the class struggle on the basis of the generalization of industrial relations and social reform. The attempt to contain the growing class struggle by sustaining accumulation through expansionary fiscal and monetary policies provoked an inflationary crisis and stimulated the development of a new forms of class struggle directed not at capital but at the state. Monetarism. Monetarism researched the subordination of the state and civil society to the money power of global capital. However, it is an open question whether monetarism represents a new phase in the periodization of the capitalist state, or merely a moment in the crisis of the social democratic form of the state, as the interwar period marked the crisis of imperialist form of the state. Let us examine this periodization more closely. However, before we do that, I'm going to, because the first part was pretty abstract, I'm going to try and break it down, basically, into bulletins, so that you can follow along easier. Alright, I got the explanation of the accumulation of the state and all that, broken down into 12 points in 3 sections. So, Section 1, endless expansion creates overaccumulation. 1. The driving force of accumulation, imposed on individual capitals by the pressure of competition, is the tendency for capital to develop the productive forces without limit. 2. The response of capitals to competition is not to adjust production to the limits of the market, but to seek out new markets and reduce the cost at home. 3. Because capitalism keeps expanding production without limits, it repeatedly creates too much capital, too much production, and unstable and uneven development across the world. 4. The development of social production confronts the limits of the capitalist form as production for profit. The state cannot stand above capitalism. 1. The class character of the capitalist state is defined by the separation of the state from civil society and the corresponding subordination of the state and civil society to the rule of money and law. 2. The subordination of the state to money defines the economic form through which an overaccumulation crisis appears to the state. the political form of the state is determined by the class struggle. 3. The political stabilization of the state has to be achieved on a national basis, which presupposes that the state is able to secure the expanded reproduction of domestic productive capital. This is the only basis on which the relative surplus population can be absorbed, and therefore only basis on which the state can secure its revenues. 4. The state cannot resolve the contradictions inherent in capital accumulation. It can only contain the political impact of those contradictions. The state survives by its ability to integrate their national capitalism into the accumulation of capitalism on a world scale. And then, section 3. The global system shapes national states. 1. The limits on the ability of the states are defined by the form of the international state system. 2. The periodization of modes of integration of global accumulation correspondingly underpins the periodization of the forms of the capitalist state. 3. The tendency to the overaccumulation and the development of capital defines not only quantitative relationships, but also qualitative relationships. 4. Different periods of capitalism creates different kinds of worker resistance and political conflict, and he went over the periods. I think that condenses it down to being digestible. I'll put this in the description. Anyways, on to the next section. The crisis of mercantilism and the rise of the modern state. The growth of commercial capitalism provided the basis for emergence of the mercantilist state form. The feudal state had been no more than the organized power of the feudal landed class, the sovereign's revenues deriving from the feudal rents and feudal dues, the authority of the state being coterminous with the feudal authority of the sovereign. The growth of trade in the Middle Ages provided the sovereign and the landed class with new sources of revenue, and so underlaid the first stages in the separation of the state from civil society. However, this separation provoked long, drawn-out class and political struggles, which focused on the form of the state. By the 18th century, commercial capital had largely freed itself from its subordination to feudal landed property, while commercial activity extended far beyond the luxury goods and military supplies of the Middle Ages. Although production was increasingly subordinated to capital, the relationship remained an external one, and the capitalist penetration of production was limited. While the generalization of commodity production was associated with a steady development of the forces of production, commercial profits still depended primarily on the exploitation of monopoly powers conferred and enforced by the state rather than on the production of surplus value. While domestic trade merely redistributed the surplus product of landowners and commodity producers, foreign trade provided the opportunity for appropriating the surplus production of foreign producers. The surplus product of foreign producers. The mercantilist state form was the outcome of the attempt to solve the class struggles unleashed by the accumulation of commercial capital, seeking to ensure that monopoly powers were exploited at the expense of foreigners. Despite the formal separation of the state from civil society, public finance and administration was achieved primarily through the public endorsement of private powers and privileges. The state fostered the development of foreign commerce by aggressive commercial and colonial policies, while seeking to contain its impact on domestic production and employment by maintaining an apparatus of protective and restrictive legislation and sustaining the authority of the landed class over the mass of the population. The overaccumulation of commercial capital underlay growing competition, which appeared in the form of commercial and colonial wars and the growing burden of taxation and public debt. Pressure on profitability underlay the penetration of production by capital. In an attempt to develop new sources of profit, which eroded the established forms of authority, the result was intensification of the class struggle, whose political focus was the parasitism and corruption of the state, which came to a head most dramatically in the American and French revolutions, but equally underlaid the rise of popular radicalism in Europe in the first half of the 19th century. The penetration of capital into production undermined the mercantilist state form and laid the foundations for the emergence of a new form of the state, in which the accumulation of capital would be based on the penetration of capital into production and the development of the world market through trade liberalization. This required the radical separation of the state from civil society by dismantling the apparatus of mercantilist regulation to subordinate the accumulation of capital to the disintegrated rule of money and law. This was achieved in England through the Quiet Revolution and government from Pitt to Gladstone, in continental Europe through the reconstitution of the state in the wake of the 1848 revolutions, and the US in the period after the Civil War. Alright, so to break this down simply, first you have the feudal state, and it was simply just the organized power of the feudal landed class, okay? But as trade grew during the Middle Ages, kings and governments gained new sources of revenue, and this shift caused regular society to slowly separate from the state, triggering a quote-unquote long drawn-out class and political struggles over who should hold power, okay? That's the fall of the feudalism, okay? And then from here, you have the mercantilist system form, and how this system worked is that profits depended primarily on the exploitation of monopoly powers conferred and enforced by the state, and so as a result, the government used aggressive military and colonial policies to make sure merchants could steal or capture the wealth of other nations. Eventually, the system broke down because too many merchants were competing for the same profits. This overaccumulation of commercial capital underlay growing competition, which appeared in the form of commercial and colonial wars and a growing burden of taxation and public debt. Capitalists started moving directly into the manufacturing sector to find new ways to make money. As they altered how goods were produced, old laws and feudal privileges stood in the way, and people grew furious at the parasitism and corruption of the mercantile state. And so therefore, the old mercantile state had to be destroyed, requiring the radical separation of the state from civil society by dismantling the apparatus of mercantilist regulation. The modern state emerged, subordinating the entire economy to the quote-unquote disinterested rule of money and law. Okay, and then you have, and from there you can see how that leads to, the global world order that we live in today. The liberal state form. The condition for the emergence of the liberal state form was the development of an international division of labor, which was essentially complementary rather than competitive, based on the penetration of capital into the production on a global scale. Fostered by commercial expansionism and trade liberalization in the second quarter of the 19th century, followed by the development of the railways to the third quarter of the century, the rapid development of the productive forces in British manufacturing stimulated the overaccumulation of manufacturing capital in relation to the supplies of raw material and the outlets for the product, which erupted in periodic crises. However, capital was able to overcome the resulting barriers to accumulation on the basis of the extensive development of agriculture on a world scale. On the other hand, in the destruction of petty commodities on the other, thus, periodically, crises had only prepared for the way for renewed accumulation, primarily by devaluing commercial capital and destroying petty producers. The complementary accumulation of capital in agriculture and manufacturing undermined mercantilist forms of regulation on a global scale and generalized the class struggle, which underlay the emergence of the liberal state form. However, the unfettered accumulation of capital and the perfection of the liberal state form unleashed new waves of struggle. The popular radicalism of displaced petty producers tended to follow the course of the cycle, augmented in periods of crises by the struggles of the emerging working class, while the state responded to disorder by the repressive enforcement of the rule of law. Popular resistance and the development of the working class organization checked the attempt of the state to subordinate the masses of the population to the money power of capital, and underlay the continued relief of distress, the reproduction of the social power of the landed class, the beginning of the protective industrial legislation, and the faltering recognition of limited trade unions' rights for the working class. Nonetheless, while the accumulation of domestic productive capital absorbed the relative surplus population and the healthy profits ameliorated the class struggle over the production of surplus value, such remedies could appear as ad hoc and exceptional responses to the frictionless problems of transition and periodic crises. The world crisis of 1873 marked the limits of this form of global accumulation, which appeared in the collapse of the world promotional boom, centered on the railways. This was not followed, as previously such crises had been, by a renewed expansionary wave, but led to the emergence of generalized overproduction and sectoral and geographic dislocation of accumulation. The crisis appeared to capital in the form of intensified and international competition, pressure on profitability, and the devaluation of capital and the destruction of productivity capacity. the crises appeared to the working class in the form of an attempt of employers to intensify labor and force down money wages, and widespread redundancy and unemployment. The crises appeared to the state in the form of growing fiscal, financial, and monetary crises as declining revenues disrupted the public finances, and the dislocation of accumulation disrupted domestic and international payments, and in the form of growing popular unrest, which could only be intensified by the attempt to resolve the economic crises within the framework of free trade and the global standard by orthodox deflationary means. Thus, the crisis of accumulation precipitated a crisis of the state and unleashed a new wave of class struggle over the form of the state, and the outcome, which was the emergence of the imperialist state form. And Marx actually talks about this in Capital, and Imperialism talks about, he didn't get enough time to write it, but he did actually talk about it in his Journalism, which you should definitely read. It's pretty easy to read too. The imperial state form. While the emerging socialist movement called for the socialization of production, and the romantic conservatism called for the resurrection of pre-capitalist forms of regulation, the state responded to the crises within the limits of its capitalist form, through which the state and civil society alike were subordinate to the power of capital, which had been perfected in the liberal phase. The separation of the state from civil society and its subordination to the role of money in law had been institutionalized in the form of the independence of the judiciary in the central bank, the formal subordinate of the executive to the legislative branch of government, and the rationalization of the system of public accounting and finance, and the constitutional principles of the balanced budget in the gold standard. The constitutional limits of the liberal state form correspondingly confirmed the political response of the state to the crisis within the limits of capital. The state responded to the challenge of the organized working class within the limits of its form by attempting to institutionalize and reinforce sectional divides by providing limited recognition for trade unions within an emerging industrial relations framework, and by introducing limited social reform while reconstituting the working class politically and a national basis through the extension of the franchise. The condition for the success of such a project was the sustained accumulation of domestic productive capital through which to absorb the relative surplus population, to keep down the cost of social reform, and institutionalize the system of industrial relations. Protectionism and imperialism provided the means by which the state simultaneously sought to resolve the immediate fiscal, financial, and monetary pressures, to secure the national identification of the working class, and to secure the renewed accumulation of domestic productive capital by removing the barriers to accumulation presented by limiting supplies of the means of production and subsistence on the one hand, and the limited outlets for the surplus product on the other. Imperialism and protectionism provided the basis on which global accumulation was sustained through the 1880s and accelerated to new heights from the 1890s. Tariffs represented a limited barrier to global accumulation, as protectionism was held in check by Britain's continued commitment to free trade and its ability to manage an international payment system in which massive flows financed the trade imbalances associated with the uneven sectoral and geographic accumulation of capital. Thus, advanced manufacturing capital, particularly in Germany and the United States, was able to find outlets for its surplus product on world markets, while booming demand for food and raw materials stimulated the rapid penetration of capital into agriculture and the renewed expansion of the railway and shipping, which provided British capital with outlets for traditional purpose products, and for the investment of its surplus capital. Thus, the early stages of the boom were based on a renewed complementarily and international division of labor, mediated by an increasingly complex system of international trade and payments. However, as the boom gathered pace, it stimulated the overaccumulation of capital to a hitherto unprecedented degree, and growing international competition and domestic conflict undermined tendencies towards liberalization. The imperial state form politicized growing competitive pressures as nation-states attempted to sustain the accumulation of domestic productive capital by the increasing use of diplomatic, political, and military weapons to open up world markets as sources of supply and outlets for the surplus product. International pressures increasingly focused on Britain's intention and British command of the seas and the global dominance of British financial capital, giving the British state the potential to inflict untold damage on its competitors, and above all on Germany, when the looming crisis struck. In the face of the growing signs of the boom had run its course, tensions mounted, culminating in inter-imperialist war. Alright, so, summarize all that together in just 5 points. So the liberal state to the imperial state. The liberal state emerged from an international division of labor, which was essentially complementary rather than competitive. Capital overcame barriers to accumulation through extensive development of agriculture on a world scale. The state enforced the rule of law, while working-class organization resisted the money power of capital. The world crisis of 1873 marked the limits of liberal accumulation. Capitalism entered a deep crisis of intensified international competition and unemployment. The crisis of overaccumulation produced the imperial state. Nation-states used diplomatic, political, and military weapons to sustain accumulation, while growing international competition and domestic conflict culminated in the First Inter-Imperialist War. The Contradictions of Imperialism and the Emergence of the Social Democratic State form. The interwar period saw the failure of the attempt to resolve the contradictions of imperialism by reconstructing the liberal world order. Free trade and the gold standard were seen as the means of subordinating the nation-state to the global accumulation of capital and the global power of money. This would thereby prevent the rise of economic nationalism, which had underlain the descent into war, and check the revolutionary challenge of the working class that had grown out of popular resistance to the cost of imperialist war, and which had acquired an increasingly anti-capitalist form as a result of the suspension of the separation of the state from civil society imposed by the needs of war. However, the reconstruction of the liberal state form could not overcome the contradictions inherent in the tendency for the accumulation to take the form of overaccumulation and crisis. Trade and monetary liberalization was facilitated by massive capitalist movements, particularly from the United States to Europe, which stimulated recovery from the post-war recession. The revolutionary challenge of the working class was contained outside Russia by repression, while the class struggle was contained by the emerging systems of industrial relations, social reform, and the franchise, which was extended to the face of the popular pressure of the war in the immediate post-war period. The boom of the 1920s intensified the overaccumulation and uneven development of capital, which was a legacy of the pre-war period that had only been reinforced by the war, culminating in a crash in 1929 and the ensuing depression. The immediate response of the state to the fiscal, financial, and monetary pressure imposed by the crash was to pursue restrictive fiscal and monetary policies and to bring accumulation back within the limits of the market. However, the extent of the overaccumulation of capital revealed by the crash was such that restrictive policies, far from restoring the conditions for renewed accumulation, set up deflationary spiral, which only intensified the crisis and threatened an escalation of the class struggle. The outcome of such pressures was the return to protectionism and imperialist policies, through which the reintegration of accumulation was achieved within relatively closed blocks. In Germany and Italy, the comprehensive defeat of the working class provided the political basis on which protectionism was complemented by extensive state intervention in the restructuring of domestic productive capital and the political integration of the working class into the corporatist apparatus of a militaristic nationalism. Elsewhere, the continued political weight of the working class was such that capital in the state largely resisted such corporatist developments until growing inter-imperialist tensions culminated once more in war. Outside the fascist powers, the political integration of the working class in the face of depression and war was achieved by further ad hoc development of the system of industrial relations, social reform, and the franchise, although the scope for such integration tended to be limited by fiscal constraint and the constraints of profitability. The reconstruction of the world economy and the international state system in the wake of the Second World War was based on similar principles to those which guided Reconstruction after the First War. The lessons of the interwar period had been learned. The political stabilization depended on the systemic social and political integration of the working class through the industrial relations, social reforms, and the franchise. The conditions for such integrations was sustained accumulation of domestic productive capital within the context of the sustained accumulation of capital on a world scale. However, the free international movement of money, capital, and commodities would not on their own overcome the barriers to accumulation presented by the overaccumulation and uneven development of capital, which had in the past led to economic crises, economic nationalism, fascism, and socialism. The conditions for such liberalization was a planned reconstruction effort to overcome the immediate barrier presented by the uneven development of the forces of production, which was the legacy of war, and the development of a system of international credit which can overcome the limitations of the gold standard by financing imbalances of international payments, so averting the need for national governments to resort either to deflation or to protection in the face of sustained payments deficits. Within such a framework, national governments could pursue expansionary domestic policies free from external constraints. Far from overcoming the tendency to the overaccumulation and uneven development of capital, the Keynesianism of the post-war boom gave such a tendency free rein, accommodating the overaccumulation of capital by an explosion of domestic and international credit, as the overaccumulation of capital confronted the barrier of the market from the 1960s. International competition eroded profitability, productive investment began to fall, and the class struggle intensified, as employers sought to hold down wages and intensify labor, and as they closed plants and laid off workers, the systematic development of social democratic forms of working class integration had institutionalized a generalized expectation of rising living standards, adequate welfare benefits, and guaranteed employment, which compelled the state to sustain accumulation by fiscal and monetary expansionism, the result of which was only to intensify the overaccumulation and uneven development of capital and to push capital into ever more speculative and inflationary channels, intensifying the inevitable crisis. The crisis of Keynesianism and the rise of monetarism. The Keynesian welfare state accommodated the aspirations of the working class at the cost of growing inflationary pressure and a growing burden of public expenditure. The crisis of Keynesianism appeared as such modes of integration confronted the limits of inflation and the fiscal crisis of the state. However, the outcome of the crisis was not a growing class polarization and a revolutionary confrontation of the working class with the capitalist state. Rather, it was an intensification of the divisions within the working class institutionalized within the social democratic state form, the eventual outcome of which was the demobilization and the demoralization of the working class. The emerging forces of the new right, and on the other hand, were able to tap growing popular resentment at the alienated forms of capitalist state power, which came to a head over the issue of inflation and taxation, which the monetarism of the new right articulated in terms of the relationship between money and the state. The neoliberal program of the new right sought to subordinate the state and civil society alike to the unfettered rule of world money. The neoliberal program of monetarism was to reconstruct the liberal state from the form of the 19th century. The fact that the new right had presided over continuing increases in state expenditure, had strengthened the power of the state, and expanded its repressive apparatuses appears to belie its liberal rhetoric. However, the fact there have not been fundamental changes in the functions of the state should not conceal the fact that neoliberalism has sought to impose fundamental changes in its form, and in particular to secure systematic subordination of the state and civil society to the money power of capital by subordinating political and social relations to the rule of money and law. The conditions for the relative success of the monetarist project were the defeat of the organized working class and the struggles precipitated by the crisis of Keynesianism, and on the one hand, and on the world boom of the mid-1980s unleashed by global liberalization and sustained by an explosion of international credit. However, these conditions are ephemeral. 19th century liberalism was able to secure the sustained accumulation of global capital, essentially because of the complementarity in the international division of labor. Since 1873, attempts to overcome the contradictions of accumulation mediated politically by the capitalist state form through liberalization in the 1890s, 1920s, and 1950s had soon come to grief as liberalization has stimulated the renewed overaccumulation and the development of capital, which has appeared in the form of growing international competition, culminating global crisis. The instability following the crash of 1987 has made it clear that the neoliberal project of the 1980s is condemned to a similar fate. The outcome of the coming crisis is by no means predictable, since the unfolding of the crisis is not determined by an economic logic, but by the development of the class struggle nationally and on a global scale. In 1914, overaccumulation led to inter-imperialist war before the crises could strike. In 1929, the crises led to depression, the formation of inter-imperialist blocs, and the later inter-imperialist war. In the late 1960s, such a development was averted as the crisis was postponed and depression staved off by inflationary means, the restructuring of capital and the working class taking place within the framework of stagflation, culminating in sharp recession of the early 1980s, which paved the way for the recent boom. The currency boom may be sustained for a while longer by the continued accumulation of capital, although the longer it is sustained and the greater the accumulation of fictitious capital on which it rests, the greater the danger of catastrophic crises and a devastating depression. In the event of such a crisis, the only means of staving off such a depression will be the strategies of state-sponsored national and international reconstruction, with the opening up of the Soviet blocs to capitalist penetration providing the most mouth-watering opportunities for the requisite global reconstruction of accumulation. However, such a global restructuring is also likely to unleash powerful national chauvinist and inter-imperialist forces. How did they know? As it politicizes the international competitive struggle, threatening to lead to the formation of competing international blocs. How did they know? A critical conclusion. The crisis of Keynesianism and the rise of monetarism raises doubts about the periodization outlined above. It is difficult to see the project of neoliberalism as that of constituting a form of post-Keynesianism or post-Fordist state, nor is it any longer possible to see neoliberalism as an aberration to be followed by a resumption of Keynesian normality, or as a transitional phase to be followed by some new post-modern form of state. If neoliberalism is a throwback to the 19th century, the only alternative on the political horizon is likely to lead to a resurgence of economic nationalism and inter-imperialist conflict, which equally harks back to the 19th century. How did they know? In this light, it seems more sensible to interpret the above periodization rather differently in essence. It conflates three levels of analysis. First, at the most abstract level, the class character of the capital state is defined in every stage of its existence by its liberal form, based on the separation of the state from civil society and their subordination to the power of money. This is correspondingly the most fundamental level of the class struggle over the form of the state. A crisis in the state form arises when the working class challenges to the power of capital extends to a challenge to the constitutional authority of the state in its relation to civil society. Secondly, there is a progressive tendency underlying the development of the capitalist state from form through which every stage of its existence, as the state responds to the challenge of the working class within the limits of its liberal form. The contradictory development of the social relation of capitalist production and the reproduction underlies the changing forms of class struggle, which in turn underlie the tendency to the socialization or of the reproduction of the working class in the alienated form of the system of industrial relations. Social welfare and social administration leading to a progressive accretion of state functions and growth in state expenditure. Thirdly, there is a typology of modes of integration of global accumulation. Liberal, imperialist, and Keynesian, which defines the forms of capitalist competition on a world scale, and so structure the relationships between particular capitals. However, it is not clear that this defines a necessary succession of stages, nor a progressive growth in state intervention, nor even that the typology is clear-cut, imperialism and Keynesianism, both being dimensions of liberalism and crises as the political priorities of nation-states, comes into conflict with the global power of money and leads to a restructuring of the global relationship between money and the state within the limits of the liberal state form. Fourthly, we could add a typology of modes of state intervention in the domestic regulation of accumulation which structure domestic competition. Fiscal incentives, the direction of investment, the direction of labor, which structures relationships between capitals and the accumulation of domestic productive capital within the limits of the liberal state form. Intervention in regulating the relations between domestic productive capitals is again essentially an aspect of liberalism and crisis, and does not have a necessary progressive tendency. The form and extent of such intervention is determined primarily by the balance of class forces. Well, that paragraph just tackles all of left populism. Where does this leave us? My purpose in this paper is not to present answers. You could try, but to raise questions for discussion. The most general conclusion would seem that by changing the forms of class struggle and the changing forms of the state are a result of a range of cross-cutting historical tendencies, which implies that history cannot be neatly packaged into structurally distinct periods. This is not to say that different historical epochs are not distinct, nor that there are progressive tendencies in play, but it is to say the distinctness of an epoch is defined at a number of levels. The basis of comparison of successive epochs is the permanence of their contradictory foundations, and the contradictory form of the social relations of capitalist production. The foundations the progressive relationship between successive epochs is determined by the progressive developments of the forces and relations of production. The distinctive characteristics of particular epochs are defined on this common foundation primarily by the balance of forces in the class struggle, and secondarily by contingent and particularistic factors. The result is that the capitalist mode of production can only be grasped as a complex totality. However, this is not the complexity of relations of structural interdependence, it is the complexity of a historical process, a process of class struggle which develops on the basis of contradictory historical foundations. Periodization does not solve the problem which gives rise to it, that of getting beyond the static fetishism of a simple essentialist structuralism, because it merely proliferates structures which remain, each in their turn, equally static and fetishistic. Far from providing a middle way between a fatalistic essentialism and a political opportunism, the periodization of the capitalist mode of production can only embrace historical specificity in the mutually exclusive forms of historical contingency and structural inevitability, either of which serve to legitimate a political opportunism in the name alternatively of the openness of the or the determinism of the oh my god. Far from providing a middle way between a fatalistic essentialism and a provided opportunism, the periodization of the capitalist mode of production can only embrace historical specificity in the mutually exclusive forms of historical contingency and structural inevitability, either of which serve to legitimate a political opportunism in the name alternatively of the openness or the determinism of the conjuncture, and both of which cut the present off from the past, and so prevent us from learning the lessons of history. Alright, so to finish off, let's go over the key takeaways from these last sections here. So, the Keynesian welfare state accommodated the aspirations of the working class at the cost of growing inflationary pressure and the growing burden of public expenditure. Reformism did not overcome capitalist contradiction, it merely deferred crisis to be bigger down the line. Additionally, this crisis did not automatically radicalize the workers. The outcome was not a growing class polarization or a revolutionary confrontation of the working class with the capitalist state, but instead it was an intensification of the division within the working class institutionalized within the social democratic state form. The new right succeeded because it channeled resentment against alienated institutions, and the emotional crux of these movements is usually inflation and taxation, which comes about as a result of the social democratic welfare state. And that's why the new right generally articulates these issues in terms of the relationship between money and the state. However, despite the new right presenting itself as an anti-state in the way, it presided over continuous increases in the state expenditure and strengthening the power of the state and expanding its repressive apparatuses. Neoliberalism is the subordination of the political and social relations to the rule of money and law under the banner of abstract freedom. The unfolding of a crisis is determined by the development of class struggle, historical contingency, and the structural inevitability both serve to legitimate a political opportunism. The distinctive caricature of the particular epochs are defined primarily by the balance of forces in the class struggle. This is the problem with left populism, reformism, all that, as politics cannot be understood through discourse alone, nor through leaders, nor through people versus elites rhetoric, but through material class organization and struggle. An important clarification as well is that the CES isn't arguing that capitalism simply evolved into neat new stages, like the post-industrial era or the postmodern era or something like that, or, whatever he's reading in the latest Jacobin opinion piece this week, okay? The class characteristic capital state is defined by its liberal form, based on the separation of the state from civil society and the subordination of the power of money. This is the core contradiction of capitalism, no matter what particular microform of it. The state is fully democratic, but structurally capitalistic, as the class character of the capitalist state is defined by its liberal form, but a crisis in the state form arises when the working class challenges the power of capital, extends to a challenge to the constitutional authority of the state itself.